At 4:40 on a Friday afternoon, I sat in the barber's chair at Delaney's on Main Street, and when Pete ran my card for a $12 haircut, it came back declined. I'm Thomas Whitfield, 73 years old, and before I tell you what happened after that little beep, tell me where you're watching from tonight in the comments. Hit like, hit subscribe. And if you've ever spent a lifetime quietly building something of real value, only to have someone decide you'd become too old and too poor to be trusted with your own life, you already know exactly where this story is going. Pete had been cutting my hair for almost 15 years, since before his shop even had a name on the window. He tried the card twice, gave me the same careful, embarrassed look every barber in America has given some old man at some point. Not going through, Tom. You want to try another one? Try it again, I said. He did. Declined again. A teenager waiting for the next chair glanced up from his phone, then back down, uninterested, which I appreciated more than he probably knew. I told Pete I'd settle up next visit, walked out to my car, and sat there a long moment before I called my daughter, Melissa. She answered on the third ring, her voice carrying that particular brightness people use when they've rehearsed something and are hoping you won't notice. Hey, Dad. My card got declined at the barber's, Melissa. $12, a pause, then careful words. Yeah, so Greg and I set up a new account structure for your pension last week. A managed account through his financial guy. It's supposed to protect the money better, but I guess there's a hold on the debit card while it transfers over. I sat very still. A managed account? For my pension? We just want to make sure it lasts, Dad. You're 73. We don't want you running out of money later because nobody was watching it closely. In the background, I heard my son-in-law's voice, unbothered, unlowered. Tell him it's temporary. He'll be fine for a few days. Melissa didn't repeat it. She didn't need to. I heard it clearly enough through the phone. I understand, I said. Thank you. And I hung up because 38 years of teaching high school chemistry to teenagers who desperately wanted to argue with me taught me exactly one thing above everything else. The moment you feel the urge to raise your voice is the exact moment to lower it instead. I didn't drive home. I drove to my publisher's regional office 2 towns over. Let me tell you who I actually am because it matters for everything that comes after. For 38 years, I taught high school chemistry at Fairmont High, a public school in a modest working-class town, on a modest teacher's salary, in a modest 3-bedroom house I bought in 1979 and never left. Most people who know me now, since my wife Carol passed 4 years ago, know me as a quiet retired widower who drives a decade-old Honda, gets his hair cut at Delaney's, and spends his mornings tending a small backyard vegetable garden. What almost nobody in my current life knows, because I stopped mentioning it decades ago when it stopped seeming relevant to anyone, is that back in 1994, frustrated with the textbooks available to me, I wrote my own introductory chemistry textbook, self-published it through a small academic press, and it slowly, over 3 decades, became one of the most widely adopted high school chemistry textbooks in the country. It's currently used in over 4,000 classrooms across 41 states. Every edition, every printing, every digital license generates royalties. Last year, those royalties, combined with careful investments Carol and I made together over the decades, totaled a little over $340,000. I have never once in my adult life needed anyone's help affording a $12 haircut. I never talked about the book much outside of academic circles. Carol used to say the textbook stayed in my study and the husband came home, and I liked that division. My daughter Melissa grew up believing her father wrote some school materials on the side, which was technically true, and mostly what a busy teenager wanted to believe anyway. Melissa married Greg Halloran 12 years ago. Greg sells commercial HVAC systems, a hard-working, occasionally overconfident man who has called me Tom for 12 years. Never Dad, which I never bothered correcting. The same way I never correct people who assume a retired public school teacher driving an old Honda must be scraping by on Social Security. About 7 months ago, Greg started helping with my finances. It began small. He noticed I still got paper statements from my brokerage and offered to help me modernize, set up online access, consolidate accounts for efficiency. I let him, mostly to please Melissa, and because I genuinely find financial apps tedious in a way I never found chemistry. He linked accounts, reset passwords for security, and slowly took on more. I trusted him. He was my daughter's husband and the father of my only grandchild. I want to tell you about the moment I should have paid closer attention to, because I've replayed it many times since. About 4 months ago at a family dinner, I misplaced my reading glasses twice in 1 week, once finding them in the refrigerator, of all places, because I'd been thinking about a recipe while cleaning them. My granddaughter Ava, 13, said to her mother, not unkindly, just thoughtlessly, the way 13-year-olds say things, "Grandpa's getting kind of forgetful, isn't he?" Melissa laughed it off. I laughed it off too. Everyone misplaces glasses. I didn't think about that sentence again until 3 weeks ago, when I arrived at Melissa and Greg's house for what I believed was an ordinary Sunday dinner, and found something waiting on their kitchen table that would occupy the next several months of my life. Greg sat at the head of the table with a manila folder squared precisely in front of him, the posture of a man who'd rehearsed a speech and wanted the folder noticed before he was. Melissa stood at the stove, back half-turned. Ava sat at the island with her homework. "Tom," Greg said, "sit down. There's something we need to go over." I sat. He slid the folder across the table. Inside was a proposal, professionally formatted, suggesting I sell my house and move into a senior living community, with the proceeds managed by the family to fund long-term care planning. Beneath it sat a durable power of attorney form, already partially filled in, naming Greg Halloran as agent. I read every line twice before I said a word, because 38 years of teaching taught me that the person who speaks first in a room like this usually loses control of the conversation. "What's prompted this?" I said finally. "Exactly." Greg shifted. "We've been talking to Dr. Renfro. He agrees it makes sense to have some structures in place given some of what we've noticed. What has Dr. Renfro actually documented?" "He hasn't done a full evaluation yet. We wanted the framework ready first. So there's no diagnosis, not yet. But Tom, you left your stove on last month." Melissa mentioned it. I looked at my daughter. She kept her eyes on the pan. "I left a burner on low for perhaps 10 minutes, Greg, and I noticed it and turned it off myself the way anyone occasionally does." I turned back to him. "What else? You've been forgetting things." "The glasses. Missing your cardiology follow-up in February. That appointment was rescheduled by the office without informing me. I confirmed that myself the same week with their scheduling department." Greg's jaw tightened. "Tom, on a teacher's pension, even with Social Security, the numbers just don't work long-term for independent living, especially if something happens health-wise. We're trying to plan responsibly before there's a crisis." There it was. The assumption sitting underneath everything, spoken plainly for the first time, a teacher's pension. Not enough. I closed the folder and set my hands flat on the table. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want a truthful answer. Has an attorney or a certified financial planner reviewed this proposal, or did you draft it yourselves?" The silence answered more clearly than words could have. "I appreciate that you believe you're acting out of concern," I said, standing, gathering my coat. "I need time to think about this." I looked at Melissa. "Thank you for dinner." "Dad, please don't be like this," Melissa said, finally turning from the stove, her eyes bright and unhappy. "Like what?" I said. "Composed?" I drove home through the quiet evening streets with the radio off, and for the first time in a long while I felt the old, familiar clarity I used to feel grading a difficult exam, not anger, which I'd watched ruin more than one promising student's semester when they let frustration override judgment, but something quieter and more dangerous to whoever stood on the other side of it, the precise stillness of a man who has just realized he's being profoundly underestimated by people who have no real idea what he's actually built. The next morning, I drove to see my longtime friend and former department colleague, Gerald and Kemalu, who'd left teaching 15 years ago to become an elder law attorney after his own difficult experience with his mother's estate. He'd handled my will and Carol's estate after she passed, and I trusted him completely. "Tom," he said when I sat down in his small book-crowded office, "you look like a man who needs coffee before he needs advice." I told him everything. The declined card, the managed account he'd never authorized, the proposal to sell my house, the absence of any real diagnosis. He was quiet for a long moment. "I want to be direct with you," he said. "An undiagnosed parent, restricted account access, a family-drafted care proposal with no professional evaluation behind it. This is one of the most common early patterns we see in cases that eventually become financial exploitation. I'm not saying that's definitely what this is, but treat it that seriously until we know otherwise. That's exactly why I'm here. First, I want a full independent cognitive evaluation, not through Dr. Renfro since your family has an existing relationship there. Second, do not sign anything, even something that looks harmless. Agreed on both. Over the following 3 weeks, I did precisely what Gerald advised, and I did something else besides. Something that came naturally after decades of grading and record keeping. I documented everything. I bought a simple spiral notebook, the same kind I'd used for lesson plans for 38 years, and began recording dates, exact wording. Timestamps March the 2nd. Greg mentioned, unprompted, that the Willowbrook Senior Community has a lovely independent living wing. Just so you know it exists, March the 9th. Melissa called to check in, asked twice in one conversation whether I remembered taking my cholesterol medication, which I've taken at the identical time daily for 11 years, March the 15th. Ava, at a family gathering, told a cousin that Grandpa's not really keeping up with things anymore, while I stood close enough to hear every word over a plate of deviled eggs. Alone, each entry sounded like nothing. A concerned family checking on an aging father. Together they formed something else entirely, a quiet, incremental construction of a narrative of my incompetence, built without a shred of medical evidence, in service of controlling my finances and my home. I saw the neuropsychologist Gerald recommended, Dr. Adaeze Okonjo, on a Thursday. 4 hours of cognitive testing. She called with results 2 weeks later. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, since I'd deliberately not mentioned my career, wanting unbiased results, "your cognitive function is entirely within normal range for your age, and above normal range on several measures, particularly verbal reasoning and working memory. There is no evidence whatsoever of dementia or cognitive impairment." I sat with that in my kitchen, at the same table where I'd once graded 1,000 chemistry exams. I need that documented, notarized, dated 2 copies. Of course. "May I ask what's prompted this?" "My family," I said, "has decided I might need protecting from myself. I'd like to know on paper whether they're right." Gerald called the moment Dr. Okonjo's report arrived. This is exactly what we needed. A clean, independent, notarized evaluation showing full capacity, obtained before any petition or transfer was actually filed. If Greg moves forward with selling your house or restructuring your finances now, without your informed consent, he's acting against a fully documented, competent adult based purely on assumption. There was one more piece, and it came from an unexpected place. I decided quietly to visit my publisher's regional office myself, the same trip that had started this whole chapter. Initially, just to check whether my royalty payments were still being deposited correctly, given the account changes Greg had made. The regional director, a woman named Priscilla Fenwick, who'd handled my account for over a decade, pulled up my file and her expression shifted. "Mr. Whitfield, I'm seeing a request submitted about 6 weeks ago, asking us to redirect your quarterly royalty deposits to a new account, with a note authorizing Gregory Halloran as a secondary contact for financial correspondence." "I never authorized that." She turned the screen toward me. "There, digitally signed, was my name, on a document I had never seen in my life. Can that be verified?" I asked, though I already knew. "We can have this reviewed by our account security team immediately, if you believe it wasn't authorized by you." "I believe exactly that. I want to tell you what I felt walking out of that office, because it would have been easy to feel simple anger toward my son-in-law. What I actually felt, standing in that parking lot, was closer to grief. Somewhere in the last year, a man I had welcomed into my family had decided the easiest way to manage an inconvenient older man was not to speak with him honestly, but to quietly redirect his life's earnings around him. I called Gerald that evening and told him about the signature. He was quiet a moment. "Tom, I need to ask you something important. What outcome do you actually want here? We now have enough, the capacity evaluation, the documented pattern, potentially a forged royalty redirection, to pursue this aggressively if you choose." I thought about Melissa standing at that stove, unable to look at me. I thought about Ava. "I don't want to destroy my daughter's marriage," I said finally. "But I built that textbook from nothing, one careful chapter at a time, Over years of nights and summers while still teaching full-time, and I'm not going to sit quietly while a man decides, without a shred of evidence, that I've become someone who needs managing instead of asking. I want the truth on the table. All of it. That, Gerald said, we can build. We spent 2 weeks preparing. Gerald drafted a formal letter revoking any account access Greg had been granted, supported by the publisher's own security findings, which confirmed within 10 days that the signature authorizing the royalty redirection did not match any verified signature on file, and had been submitted using an online portal login Greg himself had set up under the guise of helping modernize things. I invited Melissa and Greg to my house myself. I'd like you both to come Sunday evening. There are things I need to go over. Dad, is everything okay? Everything is about to be very clear, I said. They arrived at 6. Gerald sat quietly at the end of my dining table, introduced simply as my attorney, a phrase that visibly unsettled them both. I opened my own folder in the center of the table where Greg's had sat weeks earlier. First, I want you both to see this. I slid Dr. Okonjo's evaluation across. Melissa read the summary and went pale. Full capacity. No evidence of cognitive impairment. I had this done 3 weeks ago, I said, by a specialist with no connection to our family, precisely because I wanted an honest answer to a question you'd already decided you knew. Dad, we never said you had dementia, Melissa said. We were being cautious. You proposed selling my house, I said calmly, based on misplaced glasses, one unattended burner for 10 minutes, and a rescheduled appointment that wasn't even my error. That isn't caution, Melissa. That's a conclusion you'd already reached, looking for evidence to support it. I slid the second document across, the publisher's findings. Greg's face lost its color entirely. I never meant to forge anything, he said quickly. I had access to the portal from helping set it up. I used the same login. I figured since I was managing things anyway. You didn't think you needed to ask, I said, finishing his sentence. That's the entire problem, Greg. Not that you didn't care. I believe you cared. The problem is somewhere along the way. You stopped believing you needed my permission to redirect income from a book I spent years of my life writing. The room went very quiet. Finally, I told them who I actually was. In 1994, I said, frustrated with the textbooks available to my students, I wrote my own chemistry textbook. It's currently used in over 4,000 classrooms across this country. Last year, the royalties from that book, combined with careful investing your mother and I did together, came to a little over $340,000. I looked at Melissa. I never made a point of telling you the number because I never wanted the book to define how you saw your father. I wanted you to know me as your dad, not a royalty statement. Melissa stared at me. 340,000. Dad, this whole time. Greg put both hands over his face for a long moment. When he lowered them, his eyes were wet, and I want to be fair here because what came next was not performance. I convinced myself I was protecting the family's future, he said. I kept telling myself on a teacher's pension, the numbers just don't add up long term. So I never once actually asked what your real financial picture looked like. I just assumed I already knew. He looked at Melissa. I told you I'd talked it through with him. You told me it made sense financially, Melissa said slowly. You never said you'd actually shown him the numbers or asked him directly. I never asked him, Greg admitted. Not really. I let that settle in the room. Because there is nothing more useful than allowing people to hear their own admissions spoken aloud without anyone rushing to soften them. I'm not here tonight to file anything against either of you, I said. Gerald can tell you we could, but that isn't what I want. I closed the folder. What I want is for this family to understand that concern is not the same thing as control. And love does not give anyone the right to quietly manage another adult's life or his life's work without asking him first. Melissa was crying quietly now. I let it happen, she said. I saw the little comments Ava made. I saw Greg filling out those forms, and I told myself it was easier to go along with it than make waves. I know, I said gently. That's often exactly how it happens. Not one great betrayal, a dozen small agreements to stay quiet. We talked for nearly 2 more hours. I told them I had revoked Greg's access to my accounts and my royalty correspondence, that the publisher's restrictions had been corrected, and that I would not pursue any formal complaint as long as nothing like this happened again without an honest conversation first. Before they left, Ava, who had been sitting quietly on the stairs the whole evening, came into the kitchen. "Grandpa," she said, "I didn't know any of that. About the textbook money. I know you didn't. I said that stuff about you not keeping up, in front of people. I'm sorry. You repeated what the adults around you were saying," I said. "That's not entirely on you. But I hope you remember, next time you hear someone talk about an older person that way, that there's usually a lot more to the story than a misplaced pair of glasses. The months that followed weren't dramatic. There was no single grand reconciliation scene. Greg called himself, without Melissa prompting him, about 2 weeks later, and asked if he could take me to lunch, just the two of us. We sat in a diner booth for nearly 2 hours. He asked me, for the first time in 12 years of marriage to my daughter, real questions about the textbook, about how I'd actually written it while teaching full-time, about what it had meant to hold a finished copy for the first time. Not performed curiosity. Real questions, I think, he said toward the end, turning his coffee cup slowly. I got so focused on planning for a version of your future I'd already decided was inevitable, that I stopped seeing you as someone with a life I didn't fully understand yet. I just saw a fixed income and a house that needed managing. That's the danger of good intentions, I told him. They rarely feel like arrogance from the inside. Melissa started calling more often, not to check on my medication, but simply to talk, the way we used to before all this began. Ava started coming by on Saturday afternoons, ostensibly to get help with her chemistry homework, though I suspect it was mostly an excuse to sit and ask questions about how a textbook actually gets written and published, and what it had felt like walking into a bookstore for the first time and seeing my own name on a spine. I found I didn't mind the questions at all. I found, honestly, that I had missed being asked things by my family instead of being quietly managed by them. About a year after that Friday afternoon at Delaney's, I sat back down in Pete's chair for a $12 haircut. 12 even, Pete said. The card went through without a sound. No hesitation, no red beep. No teenager glancing up wondering quietly whether the old man in the chair had started to slip. Just an ordinary transaction on an ordinary afternoon. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed. A text from Ava. Got a 94 on the chem test. The chapter on stoichiometry made way more sense once you explained it, like you did the fireworks thing. Also, can I read the actual book sometime, the real one you wrote? I smiled, got into my old Honda, and drove home through the quiet afternoon light. The lesson I carry out of all this is not complicated, though it took 38 years in a classroom, and one very difficult year inside my own family, to fully understand it outside of chemistry. Loving someone does not give you the authority to decide, quietly and without asking, that they've become incapable, or that the modest life they've chosen to live means they have nothing left worth protecting. Real respect means asking the harder question directly, even when assuming feels faster and kinder in the moment. And sometimes the people who most need reminding of a person's full worth are the ones who love them the most, and simply forgot to ask before they started managing. If this story reminded you of someone in your own family, a parent, a teacher, or perhaps even yourself, I hope you'll remember to ask before you assume. And if it moved you, I'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribed for more stories about family, dignity, and the quiet strength it takes to demand to be asked instead of managed.